The Fairy type, introduced over 10 years ago but still remains the newest type. It's pretty good offensively and defensively, and single-handedly made the Dragon type lose all of its value. So here we go, calculating the best Fairy type combination. To calculate the greatest type combination for this video, I will be using this formula. Hopefully I can simplify it and explain this quickly. So basically a type combination will gain 2 points for each type it is super effective against, and a bonus 1 point if both of its affiliated types are super effective against the same type. It will lose 2 points for each weaknesses, an additional loss of 3 points if it has a double weakness. It will gain half a point for each resistance, another half point for every double resistance, lose 2 points if both types are resisted by the same type, gain 2 for each immunity, and lose 2 for each liability, which are types that are immune against it. Hopefully you understood that. If there is a tiebreaker, I will just choose. And since we're dealing with the Fairy type, I will only talk about the combination's immunity to a dragon if it involves more than just the Dragon type, since all Fairy type has this characteristic. In 17th, and the worst Fairy type combination is Fairy and Grass. This combination is super effective against 6 types with 6 resistances. It also has 5 weaknesses, including a double weakness to poison, and both Grass and Fairy are resisted by steel, poison, and fire. Final score, -2. In 16th is Fairy and Bug. This combination is super effective against 5 types, with both Fairy and Bug being super effective against Dark. It would have 5 resistances, including double resistance to fighting, and also 5 weaknesses. Both Fairy and Bug are resisted by fire, steel, and poison. Final score, 0. In 15th is Fairy and Dragon. This combination is super effective against 3 types, with both Fairy and Dragon being super effective against Dragon. It would have 7 resistances and 4 weaknesses. Plus is a liability to Fairy. Both Fairy and Dragon are resisted by steel. Final score, 0.5. And 14th is Fairy and Ice. This combination is super effective against 6 types, with both Ice and Fairy being super effective against Dragon. It would have 3 resistances and 4 weaknesses, including a double weakness to steel. Both Ice and Fairy are resisted by steel and fire. Final score, 1.5. In 13th is Fairy and Psychic. This combination is super effective against 4 types, with both Fairy and Psychic being super effective against fighting. It would have 2 resistances, including a double resistance to fighting, and only 3 weaknesses. Plus it's a liability to Dark, and both Psychic and Fairy are resisted by steel. Final score, 2.5. In 12th is Fairy and Normal. This combination is super effective against 3 types with 2 resistances. It also has 2 weaknesses, and both Fairy and Normal are resisted by steel. It has the immunity to Ghost and Dragon, but liability to Ghost. Final score, 3. In 11th is Fairy and Poison. This combination is super effective against 5 types with 5 resistances, including a double resistance to Bug and Fighting. It also has 3 weaknesses, and both Poison and Fairy are resisted by Poison, plus is a liability against Steel. Final score, 5.5. In 10th is Fairy and Rock. This combination is super effective against 7 types with 5 resistances. It also has 4 weaknesses, including a double weakness to Steel, and both Fairy and Rock are resisted by Steel. Final score, 5.5. In 9th is Fairy and Fighting. This combination is super effective against 7 types, with both Fairy and Fighting being super effective against Dark. It would have 4 resistances, including a double resistance to both Bug and Dark. It would have 5 weaknesses and a liability to Ghost, and both Fighting and Fairy are resisted by Poison. Final score, 6. In 8th is Fairy and Flying. This combination is super effective against 5 types, with both Fairy and Flying being super effective against Fighting. It would have 4 resistances, including a double resistance to both Bug and Fighting. It also has 5 weaknesses, and both Fairy and Flying are resisted by Steel, but does have the immunity to Dragon and Ground. Final score, 6. In 7th is Fairy and Electric. This combination is super effective against 5 types, with 5 resistances. It only has 2 weaknesses, and is a liability to Ground. Final score, 8.5. In 6th is Fairy and Dark. This combination is super effective against 5 types with 2 resistances, including a double resistance to Dark. It also has 3 weaknesses and the immunity to Psychic and Dragon. Final score, 9.5. In 5th is Fairy and Fire. This type combination doesn't exist. If it did, it would be super effective against 7 types with 7 resistances. Plus, it has a double resistance to Bug. It also has 4 weaknesses, and both Fairy and Fire are resisted by fire. Final score, 10.5. In 4th is Fairy and Water. This combination is super effective against 6 types with 6 resistances. It also has 3 weaknesses and a final score of 11. In 3rd is Fairy and Ghost. This combination is super effective against 5 types with only 1 resistance, which is a double resistance to Bug. It also has 2 weaknesses plus the immunity to Normal, Fighting, and Dragon, but liability to Normal. Final score, 11. In 2nd place is Fairy and Ground. This type combination doesn't exist. If it did, it would be super effective against 8 types with 4 resistances. It also has 4 weaknesses and is a liability to Flying, but has the immunity to Electric and Dragon. Final score, 12. In first place and the best fairy type combination is fairy and steel. This combination is super effective against 6 types with 9 resistances, including a double resistance to bug. It also only has 2 weaknesses, and both steel and fairy are resisted by fire and steel. Plus it has the immunity to dragon and poison. Final score, 13. Yeah, that's my calculation of the fairy type. Since the fairy type is overall a pretty good type, it can be paired up with almost anything and still be good. And that's the end of the video. That's about it.